This is our first video about fiscal policy for Economics 53, spring 2020, and it's one of only two because after I complete the second one and post it probably 2 days from now, that'll be the official end of the course for at least examination purposes. I'll send an audio file through an email to explain more about how we plan to wrap up the semester. This is a little on the longish side because I'm running out of time for cutting down and editing videos, so let's get moving on it rather quickly. In this, we are talking about the spending and taxing decisions of the United States government. We have an update here. One of my regrets about this video is that I can't say very much about the current recession that has just started because there's no data yet to say much about it, not even unemployment data really until about a week from now. But the data are finally just starting to come out that shows that we are indeed dipping into a recession, although this is for the first quarter of the year for real GDP. This was just released today, this morning, on the day that I cut this video, and it shouldn't surprise anyone that the national income and product accounts show that real GDP fell by about 4.5% in the first quarter of 2020. That, of course, includes January, February, and March, and so the only abnormal part of that was about the last 3 weeks of March. So it'll be the second quarter numbers that will be released almost literally 3 months from today that will show the true depths of this recession. So this is not unexpected, of course. Obviously, when everybody's staying home and not going to work, then you're going to have a collapse in GDP of some significance. This will mean, by the standards of our definition of a recession, that a recession has begun because the second quarter GDP numbers for 2020 are also going to be negative, and probably much more so negative than this. This information was in the Wall Street Journal today, and this was the headline article about the shrinkage of the economy. I was kind of amused by the graph they included, which is not a Wall Street Journal graph that was, for example, provided by the author of this, Harriet Torrey. This is actually data that comes from the Congressional Budget Office, and as you can see, they anticipate a recession that is a very steep V. The economy going down real fast and then recovering real fast, and I don't think that's very likely. I think it's going to be much more stretched out than is indicated by the graph that the CBO provided, because I think there's going to be a long lag between people going back to full spending, being able to go back to full spending, because there's a lot of distress in this economy that isn't covered by payments and bailouts and loans. And people also will be cautious for two reasons. They won't be going right back to being in large crowds, as is necessary for some businesses to thrive. Some won't even really want to be going back to work for the same reason, at least not with some degree of caution. And then also people are going to be cautious in their spending because of the impact this had upon their finances. So I think the recovery, although it will likely turn up at some point in 2020, will be relatively slow compared to what the CBO is suggesting here in this graph that was published in the Wall Street Journal. Here's what I plan to do in these two lectures. In this one, I'm going to review categories of spending and taxing, define our deficits and surpluses, although we've looked at this some already, define the connection between the deficit and the debt, and show how the debt is financed, or remind you of how the debt is financed. In the second set, we'll go back to the primary budget and discuss what are called entitlements and various long-term commitments that don't have recurring budget authority. We're going to discuss the special financial problems of Social Security and Medicare, and we're going to talk a little bit about the blend between monetary policy and fiscal policy, because I've already suggested that currently the Federal Reserve System is monetizing the deficit, or intends to, or at least will monetize a large part of it, so we'll go back to that. And we'll discuss topical issues as possible. I do intend to keep posting these through the summer because, given that I'm retiring, I'm going to convert all of my lectures over to lectures for alumni or presentations for alumni who like to come back ask me questions about these things. I get a lot of email from people saying, what's your take on this and what's your take on that? So I figure there will be some popularity for simply posting videos on some of the more controversial topics or interesting topics in fiscal and monetary policy. So I will post through the summer as the data finally becomes available. Now, when we talk about fiscal policy, that concerns itself with the spending and taxing practices of the United States government. We generally exclude discussion of state and local governments in this because that would be a course in and of itself, although their spending is important. The policy body, or bodies I should say, are the two houses of Congress, obviously, and the President of the United States and their bureaucracies. The Congressional Budget Office, called the CBO, I was just talking about them a moment ago, are responsible for the Congress of the United States, and the Office of Management and Budget is the President's office and puts out the annual budget that we're referring to here. Although the part that we're referring to here is the historical section of the budget, which is more or less independent from politics or anything else for that matter, because it's just a massive compilation of data. So CBO represents the bureaucracy that gets information and analyzes and presents data for both houses of Congress, and OMB does the same for the President of the United States. And the policy agencies that actually enact policy, generally we refer to as the U.S. Treasury because they are the agency that borrows and spends technically, but also agencies of the United States government, such as the Social Security Agency. We mostly talk about the aggregate level, and that's the U.S. Treasury. I'm going to give a couple of definitions, some jargon that we use throughout that is consistent with the budgetary language. Instead of calling spending expenditures, we call them outlays because that's the jargon that's in the budget itself. So any monetary disbursement of the U.S. government is referred to as an outlay. Revenues, of course, is self-explanatory. It does include net receipts of all kinds of the United States government from parties outside of government, typically from taxes, although not all revenues are taxes, although most are. And we know that the budget deficit, the arrow went the wrong way there, which should be on budget deficit. We know that the budget deficit is equal to the total of all outlays minus revenues. And when it's negative, the difference is the deficit. When it's positive, it's a surplus, as we'll see by example here in just a minute. And then finally, the United States public debt, as we already know, is the total sum of all outstanding U.S. Treasury securities. And net debt often refers to the amount that is in public hands, because some U.S. government debt is held internally by U.S. government agencies, such as the Social Security Trust Fund. We'll learn more about that special category in the next lecture when we start talking about entitlements. Here's a few useful facts about the federal budget before we get started. Our fiscal year starts on October the 1st, so fiscal year 2020 didn't start on January the 1st, 2020. It started on October the 1st, 2019, so we're about halfway through that year. There is a budgetary timetable by law with which Congress and the President are supposed to comply but never do. Normally, in early February, the President submits his budget as an advisory document. So when we talk about the budget of the United States or the budget of the White House or the President's budget or the Office of Management and Budget that goes by all of those names, we're talking about an advisory document where the President sends this to the Congress and recommends certain spending and taxing actions, and it may or may not become law. By April 15th, Congress is supposed to submit their version of the budget, and after that there's supposed to be some kind of reconciliation. That deadline is almost never met. In the last 10 years, it perhaps has been met once, and sometimes it's not even accomplished at all in the fiscal year. June 30th is the deadline for the passage of 13 appropriations bills for that portion of the budget that has to be appropriated annually, and that's actually a fairly small part of the budget except for the defense budget part of it. And that deadline is never matched. And in fact, in many, many years, appropriations bills are not even passed. We'll talk a little bit more about that next time. There's not a great deal of fiscal discipline in Washington right now, and there actually hasn't been for quite a long time. Years and years ago, in 1941, the United States government established a federal debt ceiling as a way to try to control the size of budget deficits by mandating that the federal debt can't go above a certain level. And that ceiling has been raised since then more than 70 times. And of course, in the last couple of years, it's been raised, and it's the event where everybody threatens to shut the government down if they don't come to an agreement, which seems to go through about a 2-year cycle. So the implied discipline of trying to force ourselves to run balanced budgets is simply circumvented consistently by the very body that created the law in the first place. Let's get into it. This is what the annual budgets look like. I don't have all of them here. Let's pause on this a little bit. I can't use a small arrow to show this, so just kind of follow me on this. And we have a more aggregated slide as the next one, but take a look at the 2019 categories and just spend a second looking down that 2019 category and seeing or column I should say, and seeing where the money is being spent. You see that Social Security is the only outlay up there that has an outlay of more than $1 trillion, followed by National Defense at 737.9, Medicare 685, on down the line. You may be surprised to see that what you thought were major departments of government, like the Department of Justice, has relatively small expenditures. In the case of Justice, only $69 billion. Department of Transportation, only $100 billion. Looking on down there, international affairs, which everyone keeps insisting we're wasting our money on, is only $53 billion out of a $4.5 trillion budget. It's almost inconsequential. And if you dream of someday becoming an astronaut or working for NASA, you can see that the general science, space, and technology part of the budget comes in at $34 billion, which may seem like a lot until you look at the scale of spending on everything else that we're pursuing these days. Agriculture, 19.5, energy, and so forth. You can see also the percentage of the outlays for 2019, and you can see the percentage growth since 1990. That one column ahead, I was in a rush to get this done today, where it says percent out 90, that should be the percent out 19, not 90. Down at the bottom, we have total outlays for the year of $4,529.1 billion. That stuff all adds up to this. Total revenues received mostly from taxes for the same year. Now this is 2019, not 2020, so this is the year that ended on the last day of September of 2019. Total revenues were $3,437 billion, and that left us with a $1 trillion budget deficit. Exactly one, or this is an estimate still. They keep revising this data for a long time to come, but the current estimate is $1,091 billion. So in a nutshell, you can see that we borrow about 20% or so of the budget at the present time, because the difference between the outlay and the revenue explains the deficit, and the deficit results in borrowed money. Let's take a look at this more in the aggregate, because these are the heavy hitting, major lifting categories. Again, you can see that Social Security alone, just Social Security payments to people my age, constitutes almost 25% of the entire federal budget. The defense outlays is sizable, also at 16.3. And when you combine the two categories of medical spending, Medicare and everything except Medicare, you can see that that takes up about 28% of the budget. So between Social Security, Medicare, and other medical, that's about 45% of the budget. And then interest on the debt currently is taking 10.6% of the budget. And so once again, you get a situation where At the bottom, you see the same numbers, the deficit of $1.091 trillion, because outlays were $4.529 trillion and revenues were $3.437 trillion. Now, the reason I have this here is because the top 5 categories listed, which are shown here, plus interest, which is not an outlay for a service or anything like that. It's just interest payments to people who own United States Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. I should say people, organizations, and governments who own United States bills, notes, and bonds. All of that adds up to 87.2% of the budget. Given right now that the deficit is 6 percentage points above that, that means that if you were trying to instantly balance the budget by cutting spending, you could eliminate all of the other agencies and spending categories aside from these 6, and you still would not balance the budget. In other words, you could take the Justice Department and tear it down, fire everybody, tear down the courts, and cover the ground with plowshares and grind the dust into the earth and salt. International aid eliminate, energy eliminate, NASA eliminate, Amtrak eliminate, all of that eliminate, and you wouldn't even come close to balancing the budget if you were trying to do it quickly on the spending side. Now, that's kind of academic because we're not trying to balance the budget at all, at any level, let alone to any degree, let alone on the spending side. It's just a question of what we would ever have to do on the spending side if we were to try to bring the budget back into balance, because it has been in balance in my lifetime, and if you were born when Bill Clinton was alive, in your lifetime as well, because it was balanced back in those years. Well, we'll see about that mostly, I think, in the next lecture. Let's take a look at the historical trends. It really was the case prior to 1976 that we ran budget surpluses except in war years. We had tax receipts and outlays were more or less matched. And then after 1977, we kind of got into a deficit mentality. This graph would probably make more sense if I had it on a small base log scale, like log 3 or something like that. Because, of course, the big gap I'm showing there for 1981 was at the time a really large gap. But, of course, looking at it on the scale of 2019 receipts and expenditures, it doesn't look like that. But it was big at the time. But you can see, nonetheless, that we have the blue representing outlays and the orange representing receipts, and you can see that they're both a little volatile, but the one that's most volatile is clearly receipts, and that's for 2 primary reasons. One is anytime there's an economic downturn, such as there is right now, then receipts plunge. You can see that in the example of the 2000 recession, and also to some extent, well, not to some extent, a great extent in the 2008-2009 recession, and you'll see it again, obviously, in the recession that we've just entered. The second factor is large tax cuts, because we don't ever tend to raise taxes, we mostly just cut them, and when we do, they result in budget deficits, or at least contribute to budget deficits in the years immediately following the tax cut. Now, when you take a look at just surpluses and deficits between 1969 and 2019, as I said, we actually have run some budget surpluses. You can see that during the Clinton administration, the deficit was being pared down, and in the final 4 years of the Clinton administration, we were actually running a budget surplus. Clinton himself deserves part of the credit for that, of course, but Bush the first, the father, deserves much of the credit because when he was president of the United States, he passed a piece of legislation, or promoted a piece of legislation that was passed, and he signed, called PAYGO, which forced Congress to cut any spending unless they could offset spending somewhere else, and prohibited them from reducing taxes unless they would cut spending to pay for it. And that was called PAYGO. And when Clinton inherited that mechanism, he enforced it. He didn't try to override it. When we come to the second, younger George Bush, though, he basically obliterated his own father's program and literally said, I am not abiding by pay-go. And as a consequence, of course, back come the deficits. And then down the deficits come during the Bush administration, partly because of the cost of fighting the war in Iraq, other costs as well, defense buildup and the like. Then with Obama, the deficits are once again pared back. And then with, of course, President Trump, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of his own policies, he's indifferent to budget deficits, it seems, as is now the entire Republican Party. We're going to head down to deficits that will go completely off this chart in the next year or two. We'll likely be running about $2 trillion budget deficits, which go considerably below the bottom of this within 6 months to a year. Again, the data lags quite a bit on fiscal material, not so much on monetary. So I was scouring even the short-term data in the Treasury bulletin, for example, and it's still not quite showing up. And that's why I can't put it in the lecture. But it's going to be there in about a month to 2 months, and it's going to be there in abundance. All of a sudden, many of these graphs will be severely distorted. Now, we've seen this before, and I'm just reminding you of this. I think, in fact, we've seen this twice. This is explaining that Treasury bills, notes, and bonds are how we finance this. These are the maturities. The bonds, for example, are 20 to 30 years. And as it says here in the text, this budget deficit is financed by the sale of interest-bearing U.S. Treasury securities to the public, including corporations, financial institutions, and foreign investors, including foreign central banks of countries with which we have been running a trade deficit, like the Bank of China, OPEC, and to the Federal Reserve System indirectly, as we know in our brief discussion about how the budget is monetized these days. These securities differ by maturity, and these are the classes sold. Now, these again are sold at competitive interest rates, and they vary from maturity to maturity, and they vary over time as market interest rates change. And I remind you that even when a short-term Treasury security is issued, it is rolled over by issuing a new one when it expires. And again, as we pointed out earlier in the class, it is not necessarily replaced with an asset of the same maturity. If you roll over a 2-year note, you may replace it with a 7-year note or vice versa. So as of December 2019, this is the most recent data that we have available. When we count up the total marketable debt of the United States Treasury, which is really its true measure of debt because that is external to outside parties. As it says down here on the bottom, this is the amount of debt that is sold to the public, foreign governments, investment funds, and so forth. It is marketable, meaning that the debt instruments can be sold and bought over and over again on private markets, just like stocks and corporate bonds. So the overall debt of the United States Treasury, as we'll see, is larger than this at about almost $23 trillion now. The marketable component, which is the amount floating around out there, earning interest and sellable and owned by various parties, stands at a little under 17 trillion of that amount. And it's broken down, as we see here, bills, notes, bonds, and tips and floating rate assets, which are inflation-adjusted assets. Now, if we look at the debt itself over history, we see that we have 3 measures that we want to look at. Now, the gross federal debt is what I call the Times Square federal debt. That's the debt that is posted in Times Square that says this is where your debt is, and it keeps clicking up minute by minute. It's only an estimate, of course. They just have it clicking at a certain pace that they adjust up and down. I bet it's clicking pretty fast right now. That debt includes internal debt owned by agencies within the government like the Social Security Administration. What we regard as the true external debt of the United States is the black line, because that is the marketable debt that is out there earning interest that the Treasury has to pay to outside parties. The net debt down there at the bottom excludes the amount that's held by the Federal Reserve System, such as in 2019 Q4, that was $2.54 trillion. But but not the debt held by other central banks, and does not include internally held agency debt, such as Medicare and Social Security trust funds, which will be explained in the lecture on entitlements. So the proxy that we'll use for the public debt will be the total marketable debt, the amount that's floating around out there earning interest. So again, you've seen this before, but now it's updated. Who owns that debt? Who owns the totally marketable U.S. Treasury debt? Well, when we look at this and compare percentages mostly, of course, from December 1995, that year is chosen because I wrote a book about this, and it was using data from 1995. It was published in 1996 and 1997. To September 2019, you can see how this has changed. You can look down here, that makes sense. I think we saw this once before, at least in the class. And insurance companies, mutual funds, state and local government, and other categories, including individuals. That's the 18% category. Foreign holdings used to be above 50% until China started boycotting the purchase of United States Treasury securities. So they haven't been picking up any, and that alone dropped it back down to 46%. But still, nearly half of the debt is held overseas by foreign investors, and we pay interest to them. The total amount that is held by the Federal Reserve System, total debt I should say, is the $22 trillion. That includes internal agency debt that we haven't talked about yet. The marketable debt we just saw a moment ago was about 16.7, although the end date is different because the ownership data lags the other data. The amount held by the Federal Reserve System, $2.4 trillion or 10%, and the federal ownership of marketable debt is 14.2%. So that's the consequence to some extent of monetizing, and it's purely the consequence of open market operations, which we've just learned about. So Federal Reserve ownership of marketable debt, how do they come to own it? Well, obviously through open market operations over all these years. When we take a look at interest on the debt, that of course is the long-term problem, potentially, because the government is obliged to pay this with a large chunk of it going overseas, given that currently 46% of this debt is held in foreign hands. Each 1% increase in effective rates, not market rates, I'll explain that in a minute, would add about $220 billion to the deficit. Now this number is going up, although when you adjust it for the size of the budget, which we do in the next slide, it's not going up. But this slide points out that this is going to be a function of two things: the size of the debt on which you are paying interest and the amount of interest you are paying on that debt. And we know that interest rates are at absolute rock bottom, can't really get any lower levels right now at 0%. And so to some extent that mitigates this problem because it keeps the value down. If in the future either markets carry interest rates up or the Federal Reserve has some reason to effectively raise them, then every 1% increase in the effective rate paid by the Treasury will add an additional $220 billion to the deficit. Now, by effective rate, I'm not talking about market rates. I'm talking about the rate that is actually being paid by coupon by all of the assets that are out there. And so, for example, if you have a 30-year bond that is earning, say, 3%, and it has 20 years to go, that rate is not going to rise no matter what market rates do. It'll be 3% for the next 20 years. However, the shorter the maturity, as they mature, the more they're going to reflect market rates. And so there's a lag between effective rates, the amount actually paid on the debt outstanding, and market rates, where finally effective rate catches up increasingly with market rates. And the shorter the term structure of maturities, the faster that's going to happen. So at some point in the future, when rates return to normal, it'll have a very costly impact upon interest on our debt. Now, what matters, though, is normalized. Net interest as a percent of outlays. And when you look at it from this perspective, it doesn't look that bad. It's generally thought that if this figure were to rise above about 15%, then it starts to grow automatically because of the impact of the debt payments upon the new deficit each year. In other words, the debt payments become so sizable that it actually begins to expand the deficit to such a degree that net interest will begin to rise automatically, mathematically, as a result of that. Now, clearly we have approached that number in the 90s, but we're nowhere near it now. But again, the reason we're not near it is because we are controlling the debt and the deficit. That's certainly not true. It's because we have rock bottom interest rates giving us a very, very effective low yield on that debt at the present time. But if interest rates rise and we don't have the debt situation underhand by then this is going to become potentially a serious problem. And that would be about 10 to 15 years on down the line. This is not really a slide that I would have to show you, but I think you might find it interesting because this will be one of the first pieces of data that will be distorted by the pandemic and the recession that has arisen from it. This shows monthly seasonal budget deficits because the Treasury, although it runs, say, a large deficit of $1 trillion in any given year, it actually runs micro budget deficits and surpluses throughout the year because of the uneven nature of tax collections. So you can see here in some months, like April 2018, the U.S. Treasury actually ran a surplus in that month alone of more than $200 billion. And you can see that every other April represented on here as well shows a significant increase. And the reason is the downside, February, March, each one of those dips way down. Those are heavy deficit months because personal income tax filers who are owed a refund file as early as they can, and that tends to be done mostly in February and March when they're requesting refunds. So there's tremendous outflows from the Treasury in those months. In contrast to that, April, and also to some extent some of the spring months, April, because tax filers who owe taxes file at the last minute, and that's almost always in April, around April 15th or so. The other months aside from April are when corporate income taxes are due. So the uneven nature of tax exemptions and tax receipts causes this extreme volatility. Now, I'm going to use this as a lead-in on the summer graphs when I start talking about monetary policy, because repurchase agreements are often used to mitigate the interest rate effects of this. If the Federal Reserve System didn't do something to smooth effectively the absorption of this debt, then interest rates would be very seasonal, predictable, and easy to speculate against. Because if every single April the Treasury has this huge surplus, and then every single February and March this Treasury has a huge deficit, then if there wasn't a mitigating agency out there like the Federal Reserve System, then of course interest rates would soar during February and March and plunge during April every single year. So that'll explain a little bit why the Federal Reserve uses repurchase agreements in the summer lectures. You don't need to worry about that because you will have a grade before that ever happens, before that lecture is posted. So this April, however, we'll see this in about 3 weeks. Instead of having the large positive value, it's going to be a hugely negative value that will take probably this entire graph off the bottom of the chart. And that's because, of course, the tax deadline for this year was extended until June 15th. So nobody who owes money is going to be paying taxes in April. And there's, in addition to that, of course, budget deficits being run because of unemployment compensation and all of these federal assistance programs that, again, will be described in the summer because we'll have the data to show their effect. And so we'll have to reconstruct a chart that has a ordinate that goes way, way, way down below minus 250. And we'll see that things are very abnormal at the present time. We're, of course, living through that. The data shows up for what we're living through here in about 3 more weeks is all, because the seasonal monthly data does not lag very long. When we talk about the deficit, though, normally we want, again, to normalize it. So we talk about the deficit as a percent of GDP and the debt as a percent of GDP. So often the standards that we try to set are 3%. That's the European Union standard they try to assure, and sometimes they succeed. In the case of countries like Greece, they don't. That budget deficits are no more than 3% of GDP of the various member states of the European Union. And so that's why that one is shown there. And you can see we don't do very good by that standard. We're basically Greece, except that we can monetize it and Greece can't. And that's the difference between us and the rest of the world. And of course, there's all this agitation, nonstop it seems, to have a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I don't support that because it would never be honored, and I don't think it's appropriate to pass legislation and add it to the U.S. Constitution, the document that has our Bill of Rights embedded into it, intending to pass a law that will never in a million years be honored and will be circumvented. It makes no more sense to do that than it is to put the federal debt limit in the U.S. Constitution. It just means that we'll have a constitutional mandate that no one will pay attention to, and everyone will figure out a way around it. So, and besides, how have we done since 1970 on the balanced budget standard? The only two presidents really who can take credit for that are the first George Bush, the older George Bush, the one everybody forgot, actually was a very good president, served for only 4 years because, of course, we don't reward competence in this country. And he was followed by Bill Clinton, who ran, as we saw, sizable surpluses during his administration. And, of course, now we're heading for record levels. The real standard, which is going to be breached here very soon, is debt as a percent of GDP. And I have this black line represented there because 2 years ago we declared emphatically that this limit was going to be held at 77%. And this is where, when we compare ourselves to European nations, we look more or less like Portugal and Spain. We have the budget discipline of Portugal and Spain. Actually, we're sort of moving away from Portugal and Spain and moving more in the direction of Greece at the present time. It is known that this year, this will probably hit 100%. So we'll finally, and we're talking, of course, about net debt as a percent of GDP, because again, internal entitlements debt really shouldn't be counted in this. And so we are looking at net debt, and that's largely the marketable debt. And the reason it's going to go to 1%, 100% I should say, is because, of course, the budget deficit is going to soar to probably $2.5 trillion this year. And of course, that's partly the consequence of the fact that the receipts are going to plunge, in addition to the programs that you've been reading about, outlay programs trying to keep this economy afloat. The budget deficit this year could hit as much as $3 trillion. And of course, that would automatically add that to the debt. So the gross debt would go to 25, and the net debt would go to about $20 trillion. Now, the Congressional Budget Office published this document before the pandemic, and it shows the federal debt held by the public anticipated to rise, as seen there sharply, between 2020, really right now, and 2030, especially in 2050. And you say, well, does that reflect the pandemic? No, that doesn't reflect the pandemic. That was a prior pandemic estimate. That reflects the fact that Social Security and Medicare and these massive entitlements programs, for demographic reasons, are expected to contribute massive values to the government's indebtedness going forward. And that'll be explained in the next lecture. Here's an interesting bit of comparison. When you listen to the news and they talk about the federal debt as a percent of GDP held by the public, they say with accuracy it's as high as it has been since World War II as a percent of GDP. And you say, World War II, really? It was as high in World War II as it is now? Yeah, take a look at that. Take a look at World War II and World War I and the Civil War. And I'll just give you a generalization that you might find it interesting to remember. Governments don't pay for wars with taxation. That makes them very unpopular. They pay for wars with debt. And that's how World War II was fought and paid for. That's how World War I was fought and paid for. That's even how the Union Army in the Civil War fought and paid for the war, or paid for their fighting, I should say. Then you may remember your parents, or you would remember, World War I was might have involved your great-grandparents, or possibly your grandparents, I suppose, but probably not, your great-grandparents. They would tell you that there was an enormous U.S. bond drive underway throughout the war, where the U.S. government was trying to encourage and was successful in encouraging small stakeholders to buy small amounts of U.S. savings bonds, $25 bonds or even $10 bonds. And of course, they were selling larger securities to corporations, and part of it was being monetized. So yeah, we had right now we're at about 80% or 82%. That hit a little above 100% toward the end of World War II. But you can see that right after the war, it was paid down very, very quickly. And it was paid down fairly slowly for the Civil War. It took about 25 years, but it was paid down. It was also paid down slowly for World War I. The difference between that and this is not being caused by a one-time expenditure for a war, although maybe we can regard this pandemic as a war of a kind, similar to war financing, to be sure, and so maybe $1 or $2 trillion of this can be explained by that, but there is no mechanism for pulling it back down very much. It'll come down some, because when people go back to work, then tax revenues will rise again, and these programs that are being used to sustain the economy will come to an end. So the $3 trillion budget deficit, of course, is not going to become the new floor. But on the other hand, the $1 trillion budget deficit has become the new floor. And what this document means when you look over there at projected is that is nonetheless expected to continue to rise simply because of the demographic effects of Social Security and Medicare and the other health programs. So it'll continue to rise throughout your lifetime, I expect, unless we do something about it. Or unless you do something about it. I'll be long dead before a solution is reached. So you take a look at the relationship between outlays and taxes. This is kind of an interesting graphic that appears in, again, the Congressional Budget Office. And you can see that income taxes pay the bulk of receipts, and Social Security and retirement taxes follow not far behind, and then finally corporate income taxes. And this is actually only through this fiscal year up until March. But you can see the connection to some extent between sources of income and outlays by function. It reflects the data we've already seen, but is a much more interesting graph. And it shows how kind of lopsided all of this is. Most of the taxes, as we see here, come from individual taxes. Actually, all but 15% of it does, because the big blue is individual income taxes, and this is the fiscal year 2020 to date, and the big orange is Social Security and retirement receipts, and this is being made for the largest part for the Social Security system. Now you can say that the company that you work for pays for half of that, so it's a tax upon them. That's being reflected here is a tax paid by an individual, so that's certainly true. But net corporate taxes, of course, in the United States were never very high, then we've just recently cut them. They're going back up a little bit more now because the economy is growing, but in 2017, as it notes up there, the net corporate taxes were $297 billion. And 2018, because of the tax cut of that year, those fell to $204 billion. And I did look at the data, and it's still not up to the original 2017 number in 2020. So it's mostly you who pay the taxes, although it's mostly Social Security and healthcare beneficiaries that get the lion's share of the outlays. Now, this graph here is much older, and the reason is you can't get access to the data. You can see that access denied sign up there. I can't figure out how to get into that site anymore to get the data. This is actually an IRS site. I don't think this has changed very much since 2014. It's changed some. This, to some extent, shows an impact, once again, of the maldistribution of income, but it's got an interesting result here. This, again, is for 2014 income taxes. And so, I forgot that to move the slide over so that you can see the bottom. You interpret the rightmost column, that is to say the one that says 500,000 K or more, to mean that of those who filed income tax returns, some individual, some joint, those who filed with adjusted gross income above $500,000, so that's a category of people who filed income taxes either jointly or individually that had a gross income above $500,000 per year. They filed less than 1% of all tax returns, but they paid 38.2% of all taxes collected from those returns. So there is a very progressive tax system in place when you talk about income taxes. When you go to the other extreme, and I'll have to read this to you because you can't read it there, although it's in the slide set that's paired to this. At the other extreme, those filing with adjusted gross income under $15,000 filed 24.5% of all tax returns and paid 0.1% of all taxes. So the larger the category of taxpayer group, the smaller the tax they paid, which of course makes sense given the progressive nature of taxes. This is why I'm sometimes a little leery when I hear people say, you know, we can solve this income distribution problem by increasing tax rates at the higher end, when you see already that the top two categories there, 200,000 and above, pay almost 60% of all tax collections at the present time. That's a pretty heavy tax burden already, it seems to me. Although I understand the appeal of trying to balance it that way. I'm not too keen, though, on doing it primarily through taxation for this reason. Those who have high incomes, and that of course includes a lot of former Harvey Mudders, because you go to work in tech, you go to work in finance, or obviously if you start as an entrepreneur, it's very easy to get above $200,000 a year, and a very sizable number of Mudders are above $500,000 per year, and they're already paying really high taxes right now. So that's just interesting, I think, to take a look at. Here are the current tax brackets, and so for those of you getting a job right away, just broke my pen here. I guess I need to buy another one of these finally. For those of you who are getting a job right away, most of you will be in 24%, but some of you will go pretty quickly to 32% as if you're single. And of course, that requires an income of $163,000 a year, which is pretty high, but still, some of you will be in that. And so the tax bracket for that is 32%, the marginal bracket for that. That's not the average, obviously. What that means is for every penny you make above, let's say for every dollar you make above $163,300, the federal income tax on that additional dollar will be 32% of the dollar. So on the federal taxes, you'll be allowed to keep 68% of the full amount. And then, of course, there'll be Social Security and state income taxes deducted from that as well. And so that pushes the amount you get to keep down to about 40%. That's why you may not be too keen on raising income taxes if you start earning this kind of money. Now, the standard deduction was, of course, increased substantially under the Trump administration, so married filing jointly is able now to take a $24,800 deduction amount before you get taxed, and that's quite sizable. So that has had the effect also of taxing the upper income brackets quite a bit. The maximum tax rate in 2016 under the Obama administration was 39.6%. So during the Trump administration, it has been reduced from that, clearly. I'll mention you have to also think about this. You do have to pay the employment tax, and I forgot to look up the cap for this. The numbers don't change very much, but the cap is different that I'm showing here. It's probably about $2,000 more. I forgot to change this slide. And so basically, 15.3% of your earned income, no matter what you earn, is going to be taken out for the so-called FICA tax. And that's to pay for Social Security and Medicare. And half of that's paid by your employer, and you pay half of it. So basically, your tax on this is 7.65% of 107.65% of your salary. So you can look up the 15.3% is entirely something you're paying because it's in your benefit. Your employer is going to say, no, I pay half of that. It's my cost, not yours. So it's just a matter of perspective on that. But that again means that once you add this to the income tax and say the California state income tax, your tax burden is going to be very, very high, at least until you get married and get a little relief. Now, there's a few general observations we can make, and then I can wrap this up. And then we're going to end this also with some key takeaways that you can remember for the examination. Short-term budget deficits can be caused by the decline in tax receipts during recessions. So that's going to happen right now and is currently happening. It's going to be showing up in the data before long. Structural deficits, which is unlike the deficit we ran for World War II, are more harmful, and they're generally caused more by tax cuts than by increases in spending. It's these tax cuts that sort of ushers in the deficit that just sticks with us. It is not a cyclical deficit. It's just built into the structure. Spending has been largely independent of whatever president or political party has been in power. That line just sort of goes straight up. They changed the composition of the spending, which is why the Republicans have been unsuccessful in getting spending cuts altogether, because when they're in power, they tend to like to boost defense spending while cutting all other categories. And then not all other categories, some other categories, and then the Democrats as often as not reverse that and cut back a little on the growth in defense spending and increase social support programs. We're not going to bring out the old aggregate supply, aggregate demand model anymore, but we do remember that deficits stimulate the economy in the short run. That's why we're running such large deficits right now. It will have a strong stimulating effect. But we also remember that these deficits have to be monetized. There's no other way to sell this level of Treasury securities, and that may eventually introduce some very serious long-range problems. And not just inflation. The mere capacity to simply honor debt payments may become a problem at some point. And then, of course, inflation as a possibility is always in the future. I end this lecture, as I do all of them since the pandemic began, with some key takeaways that you should try to understand. This is where you want to go for about 80% of the quiz questioning that you're going to get. And when the calendar is said, it's going to be posted, the first one on Sunday, May the 5th, I believe. If not, it's whatever it says in the calendar. I will get that up and posted, and that'll be based upon this lecture and on the next lecture. So here's a key takeaway for this lecture. 5 key categories plus interest make up the bulk of U.S. government spending. Social Security and medical outlays are absolutely huge and growing, and the CBO projections, have the deficit climbing because of these two things, as I said toward the end of this lecture. Deficits turn into debt, and now that level of debt is growing very fast. You do need to remember how these deficits are financed and what form they take. And of course, we should remember that almost 50% of it is held overseas. Interest on the debt is potentially the long-term problem. It's large and it's growing. And it's yet another reason why we're going to have trouble raising interest rates. Because even though there's a long lag between the effective rate paid and market rates, nonetheless, with the lag, when one rises, the other gradually rises with it. So if we go back to normal interest rates, we're going to have very large interest payments on our, by then, $25 or so trillion debt. The real historical standard is debt as a percentage of GDP. We said we were going to fix that at 77%. This year, it's very possibly going to go to 100. Individuals pay about 80% of the federal taxes in this economy, and the wealthy, or at least higher income groups, pay the bulk of that. As we saw, there are people in 2014 with incomes above $200,000 per year pay almost 60% of the entire tax burden. And then finally, all of this is just going to be an historical anachronism in the coming months as we begin to see these extreme distortions that arise from this pandemic. So that's it for this lecture. Wait for a couple of days and we'll start talking about Social Security, Medicare, trust funds, entitlements, the unemployment trust fund, and then that will allow us to wrap up the course. Again, I am going to deliver contemporary material, but I can't say much now because we have no data. I plan to deliver that over the summer. You can't be graded on that. Your grade will be in. You may already have your diploma in hand. But if you're interested in seeing the update to all of this and how the pandemic finally did affect it all, these slides will still be continued for a long time, even under the Econ 53 banner. At some point, probably in the fall, I'm going to convert that all over to subject-based alumni material and sort of change the perspective, emphasizing mostly finance and entrepreneurship, because alumni are always interested in going back to this. So meanwhile, we will stop with that, and I'll let you spend some time trying to digest this.